Hey guys, welcome to the Daily Word Bible Study, a plain and simple book by book, chapter by chapter, and verse by verse study through the entire Bible. We are in Luke chapter 10, and also this is a recording because happy 4th of July, and I promise I won't get controversial because, well, as Frederick Douglass asked, what is the 4th of July to the black man? But I digress, okay? But because of the holiday, I decided to record this message here, and then obviously people can view it at their leisure. We are in Luke chapter 10, and Jesus is, again, like I say, I'm trying to avoid being cliches because as I read all scripture, it's just good, and there's no exception here. So the entire chapter is just full of, again, good revelation, good teaching for us. So let me just jump to it and just get right to just get right to it. Okay. So we left off with, where did we leave off with? In chapter 10, verse number, I'm going to go back to, verse 21. Verse 21, okay? We're going to pick it up at verse 21. Jesus sent out 70 disciples to preach. They returned rejoicing because, man, they found out, man, the power of God is awesome, right? The demons subject to us. And Jesus said, well, hey, don't rejoice because demons are subject to you, but rejoice because your names are written in heaven. But wait a minute now, we can kind of back up and go, wait a minute, the demons are subject to us? Now, because of the context of our study here, we're not going to go into deep. I mean, we can, there's a lot we can explore just with that. The fact that, wait a minute, the demons are subject to us. The fact that, guess what? Common people were able to cast out devils, heal the sick. In other words, it wasn't just restricted only to the, excuse me, it just wasn't restricted only to the apostles. That here you had 70 disciples that Jesus said, go out and heal the sick. So, and the reason why I said I'm not going to get into the details of that, because there are people today pretending to heal. So the question is that if I go out and I lay hands on somebody and they don't get healed, well, what does all that mean? And that's why I said I'm not going to get into the details of that. But the 70 did return, and they were very successful. And then Jesus was like, hey, just, rejoice because your name is written in heaven. Let's not lose perspective here. And then he says to them, I watched Satan fall from heaven like a flash. And he says, I've given you authority to trample over snakes and scorpions and over all the power of the enemy, and nothing will ever harm you. All right. And that's, again, a telling statement. And you can add it to the ongoing debate whether or not do miracles happen today, which we're not going to get into. I would say this at the parting question: when did this statement cease? Okay, when did this statement cease? And then we have to also say, when you look at the plethora of so-called healing evangelists, healing ministers, when people lay hands and then they don't get healed, well, what's to be said about that? All right. Oh, excuse me. One of verse 21. All right. Verse 21 says, in that same hour he rejoiced in the Holy Spirit and said, I praise you, Father, Lord of heaven and earth, because you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned, and have revealed them to infants. Now, here's a good question. Was Jesus anti-intellectual? Now, let me just kind of unpack that. We see Paul addressing this kind of same subject in 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2, where and you have to kind of go back to the influence of Greek philosophy, which later would be kind of Christian intellectuals who came to faith that sought intellectual means to win over their fellow intellectuals. Now, this became apologetics, Christian apologetics. Okay, so we fast forward Christian apologetics, which that's basically what it is. It is kind of the intellectual means to defend the faith. Okay, so that's not the criticism here in terms of Christian apologetics. Well, what Jesus more so is, he start kind of with the idea of the Greek philosophy, the glorification of intellect, the intellectual mind, philosophy. Now, you also had this among the Jews, like the Pharisees were considered the intellectuals, the learned men. Okay, so we always had this. Even now, we have people with higher education. That there's a tendency to what? Elevate them, right? And I'll say this: college educated people doesn't mean that they are better people. In fact, when you think about college degrees, they are only as good as the field of study from which they have earned their degrees. So, for example, a doctor, a scientist, right, is brilliant in that field, but it doesn't mean that he's wise in any other field. Ben Carson is a good example of that. Okay, brilliant neuro science. He, you know, and which, by the way, it's a shame that when the president appointed him back in the first term, you would think this brilliant man, the accolades on neuroscience, he did some breakthrough surgeries, right? However, what was he appointed to? Housing. But I do digress. And that kind of shows you that, again, not everyone, again, say, well, because he's a neuroscience, hey, that means there's all spectrums of intellectualism there. It's not. You cannot take away from the field of study. It's just now when you say that because of this education, it is all across the board, but it's not. Another neuroscientist, I'm sorry, he's not a neuroscientist, he's an astrophysics, Neil deGrasse Tyson. Now, he's a brilliant man across the board. Why? Because he studies that. But what his field of study is astrophysics. Okay? But if you ask him about religion, that doesn't mean he's qualified. I would argue him on religion and the idea of atheism. I think he is an atheist. And he, so on the issue of atheist doesn't mean that he is as brilliant as an astrophysicist. Okay? And I would argue with him like on religion and things like that, the philosophy of life. I would argue with him on that in terms of his atheism, in terms of, the origins of the universe. I would argue with him on that. I wouldn't argue with him on the science of the universe, right? I would be foolish to argue with him on that. That's his field of study. Okay, that's his field of study, and and he has a brilliant mind. But watch this. But when you listen to him talk, he is well versed across the spectrum because he studies that. He researches. He reads. Okay, so he does have a lot to say on a lot of things. Why? Because he studies it, but not because he's an astrophysic, and that's my point. So when Jesus says, "Here, I praise you, Father," he says, "Lord of heaven," because you have hidden these things from the wise. The wise will have a tendency to think, because of their wisdom, their earned wisdom in a particular field of study, that they that value goes across the board, and they tend to elevate. So this is what Jesus is responding to. Okay, and of course, you have to also look at when he's not saying that any wise person cannot have access to God, cannot seek God. In other words, it's just that the wise tend to be so arrogant they don't think they need God. But they don't think that, they think that their intellects is superior, and that's what Jesus is attacking here. So that's why I said he's not that he is saying that um, um, intellectualism in itself is the problem. Notice he's quick to say the wise and the learned. These are people. Okay, so in other words, what you study, that's not what Jesus is attacking. I'll give an example. When you talk about atheism, there tend to be a lot of intellectual people who are atheists. College learned, you can say learned people. And that's what I'm saying. So they tend to think that their intellect makes them superior. Now, the reality of wise and unlearned, it doesn't change the character. See, because you have a PhD, an MA, doesn't mean that you are a good person. Doesn't mean that you are a moral person. Okay? And this is what I would even argue with any wise or learned person, is that you haven't been, you're not able to answer the questions why man is sinful, even if you don't use the word or use the word sinful. But okay, so why do good people who have nothing to lose murder? Right? Why do they do things immoral? Right? Why are they racist? So again, my point is we can go on and on and on with this. So he says you have hidden these things from the wise and the learned. Okay, so in other words, again, what Jesus is not saying, if you learning, getting the education itself is not what Jesus is attacking. I mean, as I said before, and astrophysics in his study is in astrophysics. You can't stop that. But if an astrophysics thinks, because he's the astrophysics, that his wisdom and his learning makes him superior, then you look at people and guess what? They have the same problems as everybody else. They get divorced just like everybody else. And you say, well, why do you get divorced? They cheat. They're drunkards. So why would an astrophysic be a drunkard? I mean, and I'm talking about a neuroscientist, okay. Neuroscience, I'm just not picking on astrophysics. I'm talking about the wise and the learned. In other words, whatever field of learning. When you look at the very qualities of life, they're the same. And that's the interesting thing, that they are no different than I was just watching and Okay, I was just watching some news clips on a particular um, cruise company, and what they cater to is then you have people that now they're calling the cruise line ghetto because they're showing a lot of clips of what they would say ghetto behavior, meaning black people, but also lower class. But they show that as if white people don't do that. It is learned people don't act that way. And yet you could literally go on, you could literally find clips of judges, prosecutors, obviously the police. But the police are not intellectual. That's why I don't even put them in the same category because police, police are not necessarily intellectual unless they do go to school and get degrees. But here's the point: you have state police. State police tend to be more educated than your average police officer. But obviously, lawmakers, right? We have congressmen that were what had behavior in a theater, lewd behavior in the theater, caught on camera, and then they showed out what they tried to do when they was asked to stop and then finally asked to leave. Right? Look at the behavior there. Now, so my point is that you can't. Well, why do people act that way? And these are supposed to be wise and learned. These are supposed to be the upper echelon of society, and they act the same way. It's just in our case how it is portrayed in the uh, how it is portrayed in the media. Okay, so and the same thing here. When you go to the Pharisees who were learned, remember they're going to criticize Jesus that he's unlearned. They said, how does Jesus know, right, the scriptures when he is unlearned, uneducated, right? But here's the point: they were, and their behavior was despicable. The Pharisees' behavior was despicable. Now we're going to add a level of religion to it. That the Pharisees were the biggest hypocrites. I mean, atheists don't claim to be Bible believing, but the people like the Pharisees or the religious. And again, you have to have a degree. Most denominations, you have to have a degree to be in the ministry, to pastor in the ministry. Most denominations, most. You can't be a pastor unless you get a degree. And yet, the behavior, right, is no different. So what is my point to this? When Jesus says here, you have hidden these things from the wise and the unlearned, certainly he's not elevating just because you're wise, just because you have a degree, just because you are learned, skilled, trained. That doesn't mean anything. Notice he said God hidden his truths from people with those kinds of attitudes. Okay? Paul even goes further that, that the foolish things of the world, um, the foolish things of the world, let me see if I can find that right quick. In First Corinthians here, I think I'm going to go just a tad longer. I'm going to go just a tad longer. Now watch this right here. Look at verse 18. This is 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 18 says, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But it is God's power to us who are being saved. For it is written, I will destroy the wisdom of the wise, and I will set aside the understanding of the experts. Where is the philosopher? Where is the scholar? Where is the debater of this age? Hasn't God made the world's wisdom foolish? For since in God's wisdom, the world did not know God through wisdom, God was pleased to save those who believe through the foolishness of the message preached. For the Jews ask for a sign. You see that all the time. And the Greeks seek wisdom, but we preach Christ crucified, a stumbling block to the Jews and foolishness to the Gentiles. Yet to those who are called both Jews and Greeks, Christ is God's power and God's wisdom, because God's foolishness is wiser than human wisdom, and God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Now look at this. Brothers, consider your calling. Not many wise from a human perspective, not many powerful, not many of noble birth. So again, these are the people with the attitudes. He said, instead God has chosen what is foolish in the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen what is weak in the world to shame the strong. All right. So I think you see the point here. Even here, you see Jesus himself criticizing, right, the learn. And again, it's their attitudes. It's not because they have acquired knowledge and skill, but their attitudes towards it is why he condemns them, and basically why they miss God's salvation. Why God says, hey, even his foolishness is wiser. And then again, time will fail us to really get into excuse me, time would fail us to get into a lot more, to unpack it more. But anyway, maybe again at some point when we get to 1 Corinthians, and that's down the road from here, but we will get to it. We will explore it more. All right, guys. Again, happy holidays. And don't forget to like and share this video and subscribe to BP, the Bible Perspective. And as always, if you have a thought or comment, add it to the comment section below. All comments are welcome. I'll see you in the next study.